nur sein die Enkel, die es besser ausfochten, sondern darüber hinaus. In the months that have passed since we were together in June 1942, many comrades have fallen and given their lives for Germany and for the Führer, leading them. And I ask you to stand in his honor and in the honor of all our dead SS men and dead German soldiers, men and women. Leading them from our ranks is our old comrade and friend, SS Gruppenführer Eike. I ask you to sit down. I have considered it necessary to call you, the senior leadership corps of the SS and police, together at the beginning of the 5th year of the war, which will be a very difficult year. Sober as we have always been, truthful to ourselves, we want to discuss a few things in this troop commanders meeting, as I was accustomed to doing in the long years of peace. I will present to you in as brief a manner as possible my opinion of the situation as I see it, of our tasks, of what we have done and achieved so far, and of what lies ahead for us in the future. First, the war situation. I will start with Russia. When, I believe it was in 1937 or 1938, the great show trials took place in Moscow, and the former Tsarist ensign and later Bolshevik General Tukhachevsky and other generals were shot. We all over Europe, including those in the party and the SS, were of the opinion that the Bolshevik system, that Stalin had committed one of its greatest mistakes. We were absolutely mistaken in our assessment of the situation. We can honestly say that. I believe Russia would not have lasted the 2 years of war, and it is now in the 3rd year of the war, if it had kept the former Tsarist generals. It made the political commissar a general, or it chose the person who emerged from the Red Army as a commander, as a general, so that he could also be a political commissar. The most stubborn representative of the Bolshevik will, I would like to call it doctrine, not worldview, is at the same time the commander and leader there. In 1941, the Führer attacked Russia. As we can see today, that was shortly before Stalin launched his major invasion of Central and Western Europe, perhaps a quarter to half a year. I can give a very brief outline of this first year. The attack was a success. The Russian army was rounded up in large cauldrons, wiped out and taken prisoner. Back then, we did not value the mass of people as we value them today, as raw material, as workforce, which is not a pity in the long run, if I think in terms of generations, but which is regrettable today because of the loss of workforce. The prisoners died of exhaustion and hunger in their tens and hundreds of thousands. The summer and autumn of 1941 came, the triumphal march that took us as far as Moscow, and the winter of 1941-42. The winter of 1941-42 and its consequences were partly the work of fate, which struck hard for the first time, but partly the work of the political commissars, the politruks, whose harshness and intransigence, whose fanatical, brutal will drove the raw material of the Slavic, Mongolian masses to the front and did not let them leave it. In the spring of 1942, we again attacked the Crimea, across the Donetsk to the Don and the Volga. The front of Germany and its allies was wide-ranging. If everyone had held out, the war could have ended for Russia in 1942. According to all calculations and according to all probability, which cannot be ignored in war and which must be reckoned with, the Caucasus would have fallen into our hands sooner or later. Russia would have been cut off from its main oil sources, and hunger would have affected its people even more than it does today. Our federal republic collapsed. First came the breakthrough of the Romanians, then the breakthrough of the Italian army, which was already of little value at the time, and then the breakthrough and the escape of the Hungarian units, the total loss of around 500 kilometers of front. This loss required the withdrawal of the German front in order to be able to close it again. This loss made the sacrifice of Stalingrad a fateful necessity. It is not our task to rethink every detail today. I am personally convinced that this sacrifice, and it sounds terribly harsh when I say it, was necessary, because without the enemy forces being tied up around Stalingrad, it would no longer have been possible to close the German front. I am convinced that this will be the result of research into the history of war 10, 15 or 20 years after the war. A very late consolation, so to speak. Then, in the spring, the first major battle for Kharkov took place. Kharkov was evacuated under what were sometimes, as all of our units outside know, very strange circumstances. At the right time, on the orders of the Führer, the Panzer Corps arrived in Kharkov under the command of our old comrade SS Obergruppenführer Hauser. The planned evacuation of Kharkov by the Panzer Corps was carried out by Hauser. A glorious campaign lasting weeks began, which this corps conducted in an unusually mobile manner in the open field, which I consider to be correct and appropriate for motorized and tank units. Our Panzer Corps drove the enemy away. Sepp Dietrich and his Leibstandarte were the first to break into Kharkov. Kharkov was taken again, and the German front was restored. In the late spring and summer of this year, we responded to Russian attacks with a major counterattack on Bielgorod. We can proudly state that the only corps that really broke through the Russians' deep system of positions was our SS Panzer Corps, with the Deutschland standard leading the old Das Reich division glossary. The Russians had built a position 7 kilometers deep, a model and example that we Germans cannot emphasize strongly enough. To be diligent, to dig in and build positions, because this diligence and the sweat that is shed in the process would save the lives of tens of thousands. We Germans have not yet fully learned this, even after 4 years of war. If one had to give it a school grade, the best grade for the Germans' position construction would be between 4 and 5. I have to acknowledge one thing here. Our SS divisions have learned a great deal over the last 2 years and are generally working diligently to build positions. At this point, I would like to say a few words about the assessment of the overall strength of the Russians. An important foundation for the entire assessment is the question of how many people there are in the Russians. That is the great mystery. The estimates of these people in this country, which has been hermetically sealed for decades, lie between 170 and 250 million. I have put a lot of effort into this question and have had work done that begins with the first Tsarist censuses, i.e. the first censuses that were ever carried out in Russia. At that time, there was not yet the Bolshevik tendency to hide everything in Russia from Europe and the world, from the construction of a road that is not marked to the concealment of the large industries that manufactured the tanks and aircraft, which were shown to the European in-tourist visitor as tractor factories, while the tanks were being built in the next hall. I have now had the censuses brought in that were not carried out under this law of camouflage and concealment decades before the Bolshevik rule. From this, we can calculate a certain progress, a progressive growth. Our calculations have led us to the conclusion that Russia must have 200, and in the best case, 220 million people. Listing the individual calculations here would take too long and perhaps be too boring. I come to the conclusion that in addition to the divisions currently on the Western Front, i.e. the front facing us, the Russians have squeezed an additional 4 million soldiers out of their national body at the beginning and during the course of this year. That means 400 times 10,000 men, i.e. 400 new divisions. I calculate it roughly as follows. They brought in the 1926 and in some cases 1927 generation. It is a tragic law of nature that the Russian cohorts born between 1925 and 1927 each comprise between 1.5 and 1.8 million men, while our cohorts for this period comprise only 500,000 to 600,000 men, i.e. 1/3 of the Russian number. The Russians have undoubtedly also stuffed a lot of people from even younger generations, including those born in 1928, into their companies. The Das Reich division reported that it was facing divisions in which entire companies were made up of 14 and 15-year-olds. The Russians are completely indifferent to this. For them, it is only the mass that counts, and this mass must be trampled on, stabbed and slaughtered. To use a very brutal example, it is like a pig that is stabbed and gradually bled to death. The Russians have undoubtedly strengthened their army by another 1 million people by taking on auxiliary personnel, primarily women and boys, in the baggage train, even in the battalion headquarters and as machine gunners. They obviously did not get any Chinese. However, he has brought together another 1 million from these small ethnic groups, such as Afghans, Mongols from Outer Mongolia, and Kyrgyz, who perhaps had not yet been fully mobilized. I believe that all in all, he has brought together an additional 4 million men for an offensive army. As you know, I am an optimist when it comes to the bigger picture. I know that we will win the war. That is a law of nature. However, I have always been very sober in my calculations, and I believe that I can prove here that I have never predicted wrongly in these matters. I therefore believe that the Russians have used up around 2 million people in dead, prisoners and wounded in the current offensives. So we can expect another desperate and all-out offensive by the Russians in the winter with a strength of 200 divisions, i.e. around 2 million men. We must and will endure this onslaught and this impetus. Nothing on earth is endless, and the Russians' potential is not endless either. When these Brusilov offensives, to use the comparison, are over, the Russians' potential will also come to its natural end. Hunger is a serious problem for the Russians. It is interesting that, given his mass of people, he thinks it right to keep officers and commissars physically strong and in good spirits by giving them American rations, while little Ivan is fed very poorly with a little bread or something similar. He is making the whole war with his brutally trained leadership of political officers, officer commissars or commissar officers, politruks or non-commissioned officers or politruks. It has gradually become one and the same. Now I come to another kind of war in Russia, which